What's your take on the changes over the past 40 years in black-white relations? I mean, there's been a sort of a stunning combination of both, I would say, an elimination of overt racism to a certain extent. On the other hand, obviously, there's been a degeneration in many of the inner cities, and many of the lives of African Americans are not any better than they were 50 years ago. How much do you think that, you know, what do you think your thesis has to tell us about this 50-year change? What do you think? How do you think we can understand it better with the tools that you gave us?
Well, that's a good question. It's a tough question. What I think I did and helped contribute was bring to the economists the attention that issues like black-white differences, male-female type of differences, and other sort of differences are, number one, they're very important in the economy. Number two, economists have something to say about it. Now, these are very obvious statements, but that was considered, you know, heretical, some unacceptable. When I went up, I was a young guy, went up to MIT, and I was sort of on the job market halfway, and Bob Solow, who was there, was one of the rising stars in the profession. And Bob asked me what was my thesis. I said, on discrimination. He said, I thought I was a neoclassical economist. I said, I am. I said, I think this is part of neoclassical economics. And he wouldn't accept. I mean, you know, he was polite, but he didn't accept that this was a part of neoclassical economics. I'm not sure he still accepts it, to tell you the truth. But that was, you know, he was, you know, clearly one of the top people, a young person, but one of the top people in the field. That was the perception of the field. So to make economists believe and comfortable with the notion that discrimination is important, we can say something about it, it's relevant, we can talk about occupations, we can talk about earnings, whether it's blacks, whether it's Jews, whether it's women versus men, whether it's Chinese, whatever group, you know, we're referring to, homosexuals versus not. This was, I think, a very important contribution, not only of me, but everybody else working in this area. Now, what does that contribution lead to, you're saying?
Well, just in terms of understanding the last 50 years.
In terms of understanding the last 50 years. I think, you know, I wouldn't want to say how much influence it's had over public policy in this area, because I don't really know whether it's had a significant influence or whether, you know, the growing power of blacks, growing political representation led to the civil rights laws of various types, and, you know, still debate over how much influence they had on some of these things. I think they had some influence. How much, I don't know. I think it led, if I had to say on a more practical basis, to a couple of things that maybe is of some importance in understanding the changes in the last 50 years. And there I'll bring in some of my later work as well as the discrimination work, because I don't think, I think they're very much interrelated in the sense I was led from one into the other. I think we have a greater appreciation for the importance of human capital formation and how that maybe it interacts with discrimination, but is an important force in the lower earnings of blacks, lower occupations of blacks, lower earnings of women, lower occupations of women. That somehow, if we want blacks to rise up in the economic hierarchy, we have to be worried about what kind of education they're getting. Are we discriminating against them in access to schools? Are they getting a good quality education that will prepare them? What's their family structure? What kind of backgrounds are they getting? Are they already by age 16 have fallen so far behind that they're condemned to have a lower economic position? Now, that's not just the taste for discrimination, not just that model, but it's human capital, it's family. And I see all these things as related. They're different subjects I had worked on, other people had worked on, but I was partly led from my discrimination study to the study of human capital by the evidence I have in the book of the substantial differentials in earnings both among blacks and among whites by education category. Those are data I have in one of my later chapters that I analyze a little bit, but I was very conscious of those data, and I just, when I was going to go to the National Bureau, I made it a point to say, well, this is something I'd be worth working on, how to explain those differentials. So, and I think that has contributed to the understanding. Now, can the analysis help us understand why violence increase, crime rates increase? the family broke down, even more so among blacks than among whites. I don't think the discrimination book alone, and that's where a lot of the pathologies have come. I don't think the discrimination book alone will help us appreciate that. I think that plus some of this later literature of mine and others, I think does throw a lot of light on those questions.
You, in the introduction to your Economics of Human Behavior book, you give the three main aspects of the economic approach as being maximizing behavior, which is maybe a little bit more precise than just people demand less when prices fall. I mean, that's sort of the heart of that.
Right.
And market equilibrium, which of course is related to supply curves going up and free entry. And the last is stable preferences, which at some point in time actually in this talk I should come back to, because it's hard for me to understand why stable preferences were such an important assumption. I mean, it's sort of when I read the verbiage around the stable preferences line, I sort of get the sense that you basically wanted to stop a lot of ad hoc theorizing. It wasn't that you particularly were committed to the idea that preferences were always stable, but you just didn't like the idea that people would always say, oh, there was more bread demanded on Tuesday because the preference for bread went up during that day. I mean, is that a fair characterization of what was going on there?
Yeah, it was a methodological constraint. I wanted to tie, I mean, I wasn't saying what I wanted to do. I would say the good economics that I know did that. And I said the advantage of doing that was you tied your hands to prevent these ad hoc explanations that were dominant in economics as well as in other subjects. And I give a couple examples in that introductory essay that, if there's an increased demand for meat, we don't explain it by price and income. There's a taste for meat went up. Well, that's pretty vacuous. It didn't have any analytical concept or cut or scope the way maximizing and equilibrium do. They have precise implications about behavior.
If I think about sort of forgetting about the stable preferences, if I think about maximizing people and market equilibria as being sort of the two pillars, I think of two of your earliest essays, both your dissertation and your wonderful paper on irrationality and economics behavior, which has always been one of my favorites, is really being about markets. So irrationality is not at all about preferences. It says in many cases preferences are utterly irrelevant, make the guys random, make the guys totally covered by inertia, but you still get downward sloping demand curves and upward sloping supply curves. So that's really about markets and not very interested in preferences. But then somehow or other you had a switch, and the next set of things, fertility, human capital is more complicated, but these really focused on the consumer. It really didn't, there's in your 1960 essay on fertility, there's not really a lot about the market there. Prices are taken in some sense, I mean, as exogenous. A lot of it is just thinking about what the real prices for things are. So it's sort of, saying that demand is going to be a function of what price is, and then how do we think about price properly in these areas when we're away from cash prices. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, you have to go back a little bit in time to the fertility stuff. Just talking about fertility in the sense of price and income was anathema to most people who worked on fertility. And when I gave this paper, as I recollect in some places where written, and I said, I'm going to treat children like a consumer durable, the whole place broke out laughing. And there was about 60 people. This was at a conference. And then I went into price and income, and that just way of looking at it, people found very objectionable. That was treating children like a commodity, like a good, children were really different, and so on. So I felt to go that far, it's true, I didn't really get into markets, but to go that far and to talk about price and income was about all I could do at that point because of the enormous objections to that approach. And I just tried to put forward the view that we could explain a number of the things that we see about fertility, including the business cycles. I had a little National Bureau business cycle chronology analysis in there. That this would help us in understanding that, and that's basically where I ended it up with.
So, if there was so much hostility towards your theory of fertility, the price of time, the price of children determines how many kids people have, what would your opponents have said determines the level of fertility? What was their explanation? It was just random? What was their explanation of what determines how many kids people have?
You have to realize that there was no systematic model of fertility choice that was the big competitor. The demographers didn't like theory in general, so they would just want to study carefully, as they did. It was very careful quantitative analysis. The sociologists would say it was things like what other families were doing. Social forces would determine it. Now, where they came from and how, to introduce them in a systematic fashion. That wasn't their strength, so they didn't do that type of stuff. The psychologists would determine, what children does for a woman's psyche or a man's psyche, things of that type. And so there were bits and pieces of alternative theories, but there was no systematic theory.
Right.
That's the reason why I thought that this sort of theory, whatever its limitations was, it did say about certain things very precise implications about them, and therefore could carry us a considerable distance.